So many famous literary figures have been quoted at this conference. I'm tempted to quote Hannibal Lecter and to say, I'm back. I just want to comment about a thought I had last night and again this morning. What a privilege it is to be in a room where the folks in the room represent such an incredible depth of knowledge, breadth of interests, and intensity of passion. It's just a real privilege. Thank you. I also am not surprised that the discussion got going, people got animated, people were turning in their chairs when we talked about how to share this and how to make available what we have found to young people. It was a commentary on your character, your passion, and your willingness to share. I come from, as I've explained to many of you, the center of the universe, Deer Isle, Maine. And it was in the center of the universe, in Deer Isle, Maine, that I met our next speaker at dinner, appropriately. Gail's sister, Kathy, who's an old friend from Washington, and a group of friends had come to vacation on Deer Isle, and they invited me to dinner, and I met Gail. And the word ephemera was used in introducing me to her, and we controlled the conversation for the rest of the evening at the dinner table. And I suggested to Gail McMillan that she make herself available to the Ephemera Society because she, like many of you, had found a bit of ephemera as a professor and director of the university libraries at Virginia Tech. She had acquired a collection of cookbooks, and one particular cookbook captured her eye, and that was all it took. She began collecting other ephemera related to it, and the result is the book that she's presenting here today. Her story is repeated in this room 47 times by a quick count. You've all been through it. And I'm happy to ask Gail McMillan to come forward and share your story back to you.
Well, thank you, Ron. Thank you for inviting me to tell a story of food and family that takes place in the 1800s in southwestern Virginia. Dear Nannie, yours devotedly, Charlie, is part love story, part history, part genealogy, part culinary analysis, and part cookbook. This is Anne Godwin and Charles Miles Figgett. They were born in the 1830s in Fincastle, Virginia, where they were raised and educated. About 1855, Charlie moved 40 miles northeast to Lexington, Virginia, and they started their correspondence. Anne is the first child of Thomas and Martha Mary Godwin. They're 10 children, and she's the focal point of our story, which began with a wealth of ephemera, although at the time we called it primary source material. At the time, I'm not the director of the library, I'm the director of the Digital Research and Scholarship Services Department of the library, but for 12 years I was also head of special collections, and during that time I was contacted by a Philadelphia manuscript dealer, Carmen Valentino, who offered me a box of ephemera, all relating to Southwest Virginia. And at that time we were creating a culinary history collection. So my co-author, Jean Robbins, suggested that we write an article about these recipe books. And so I started doing some research, and I found that there was correspondence between Nannie and Charlie at the Library of Virginia and the Virginia Historical Society. I found family photographs at Washington and Lee University. There were deeds and estate wills at the Clerk of Court office. There were street maps and directories at the Roanoke Public Library. The Library of Congress provided online access to newspapers, both regional and national, and my public library gave me access to Civil War records online. So we began to write the story based on these two manuscript cookbooks, written by Nannie and her mother, Martha Mary Godwin, in the 1860s. I also found in the box that we got at Virginia Tech 5 letters written between Nannie's mother and father in the 1830s, her diary, and a ledger of expenses that she recorded, mostly the foods that they purchased in 1861. And our book is illustrated with all of these images. We transcribed all of the documents. There are about 4 dozen letters, 230 handwritten recipes belonging to Nannie and her mother. Nannie, as you can see, signed and dated the inside cover of her cookbook just shortly after her marriage to Charlie. And in these 2 leather-bound volumes, you can see they're really quite small. She recorded 152 recipes. She also included several index pages, but many of those pages reflect recipes that aren't in the books. So it still tells us what's missing, what we didn't see. So we don't have a recipe for perpetual paste to mend china, or preserving ice, or flattening knives, and many others. Some of Nannie's recipes were copied directly from her mother's recipe book, but some are also from her friends and neighbors in Fincastle, and we know this because of surviving maps of her neighborhood. She also attributed many of her recipes to Mary Randolph, so we know that she was using Mary Randolph's 1824 book, The Virginia Housewife. I put in this Google map just to give you kind of a perspective about the area that I'm talking with. So A is Fincastle, Virginia, where Nannie and Charlie were born. B is Lexington, where he worked, and then she eventually moved down to Roanoke. The story only extends up to the northern Shenandoah and outside of Virginia, because Charlie was, of course, part of the Civil War. That I have to always make the caveat, I'm not a Civil War historian. But the story doesn't extend very far, but there's lots of stories to tell. This particular area of Virginia was protected from the battlefields of the Civil War. The food supply in this area and the neighboring counties was not impacted adversely by the war. For example, we know from Nannie's diary that she wrote in March of 1863 that salt was distributed. The very next month in the Richmond newspaper, the Daily Dispatch, it's telling about salt being in such a shortage in nearby Craig County that the cattle and the sheep are dying. So that gives you an idea about what life was a little different in Fincastle than in other parts that were impacted by the Civil War. So Charles Miles Figgett, as I said, was born and raised in Fincastle. He moved to Lexington about 1855, where for a few years he was a clerk in a store before he started his lifelong occupation working at the Bank of Lexington. He and Nannie were married in December of 1859. They had their first child in October of 1861. And then Charlie left with his regiment, Company C of the 1st Virginia Cavalry, in September of 1862. So you can see he was a little late in actually taking part and leaving home to take part in the Civil War. But while he was away, he and Nannie corresponded, and we've uncovered about 3 dozen of their letters. Their correspondence is very romantic, and it's also very reverent of God. And as we know, correspondence was conveyed by a variety of means at this time. So Charlie once wrote to Nannie, "I handed your letter to Mary Spiller, and she said she felt badly when she read it. She says she did not tell LR, but I believe that she was telling your aunt and Mr. B before I even got out of sight." So through my public library, like I said, I had access to some Civil War records. So this is a muster roll, and I can tell you that Charlie earned $12 a month as a soldier and 25 cents a day because he was a special clerk. He was a clerk at the headquarters of the Army of Northern Virginia. So he worked for Bull Paxton and Stonewall Jackson and Richard Early and Jubal Early. He also received 75 cents a day for, quote, commutation of rations while on duty on detached duty as clerk at headquarters. So he was enrolled with one regiment, but he worked in another. He worked wherever the headquarters was, and he got extra pay because he wasn't being fed by his unit. He had to pay for his food at the other unit. And he also earned 40 cents a day because he had his own horse. And we know that from these documents that he was given rations for his horse in what was known as requisition of for forage. So our correspondence, Charlie's mom and, or Nannie's mom and dad, one of his brothers, one of her brothers, and then Charlie and Nannie, they were all very well educated, and we know this from the grammar and the handwriting of the letters, except for the one on the far right here, and that's Nannie's mother's handwriting. And she was not very literate. Her spelling is totally phonetic and irregular. She didn't always spell the same word the same way. The first piece of correspondence we have between Nannie and Charlie, he's waiting to hear whether her parents are going to give him permission to marry her. He receives permission, and they marry in St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Fincastle, and Nannie moves to Lexington. And then shortly after that, Mary Martha, Nannie's mother, wrote to her just 2 weeks after the wedding, and she said this: "It does seem to me more than a month since you went away. I think of the wedding as something way back yonder, but as you are happy, my child, I will not be so selfish as to regret it. We did not get the house in order until Wednesday. Thursday, I went out with Eliza J. and returned her calls. Friday, I made half a bushel of tangled breeches, and that was kind of a pretzel-like sweet thing, for the children. Did not wish you had some, as you do not like them, but thought Charlie was Dutchman enough to like them, and wished he and dear Rob had some." Maybe one of you can tell me what Dutchman enough might mean. This letter also tells about sewing projects and a very quiet Christmas among the servants. Mary Martha's eldest son, Rob, was away at medical school, and her other son, Tom, would have returned to college if it hadn't been for smallpox outbreak. Martha concluded her letter: "This is a long letter for me, and I hope that you will be able to make it out, notwithstanding bad spelling. Give my love to Charlie. You must be both good children, and neither of you forget your homes. I wish to do as I would be done by. I do not want him to give up his own family for you and yours, as I have seen some folks do. I hope your hearts are large enough for both. Write me long and frequent letters, and do not be backward in letting me know anything you need. You know, if I can give it to you, it will come freely. If not, I can say no, and you must not think hard. I must close. They have brought some hogs to cut up, and I do hope they are the last. Your ever-loving mother." So this is Nannie's diary. She began to keep it the day her first son was baptized, which was nearly a year after he was born. And it covers the 3.5 years that Charlie was in the Confederate Army. And Nannie returned to Fincastle to live with her parents. Nannie's second entry reads, "My dear husband, break up our happy home and leave it. He to take his place among his fellow men whose lots have been cast in the army, there to be separated from all he holds dear. And the little one and I go to my father's house, there to seek protection and care during my husband's absence. Oh, that this little band may soon be reunited in our own happy and peaceful home, and that the trumpet of cruel war may nevermore call forth our dear ones." So Nannie wrote in her diary during this 3.5-year period quite frequently, but it was often just to say she wrote a letter to Charlie or she got a letter to Charlie. But sometimes she gave us, tidbits of what life was like. So on November 24th, 1862, she wrote that the ladies of the Soldiers' Aid Society, quote, "cut cloth for our poor destitute soldiers. Shirts, pants, drawers, etc. are all being furnished them. Cloth from Mr. Ammons was made for the government, was taken to supply the soldiers of our county first." So Benjamin Ammon had a woolen mill in Fincastle, so they were very fortunate to have access to the cloth. 2 weeks later, she wrote that she sewed hard all day to make a bed tick and got some things ready to send to Charlie. During Nannie's prolonged stay in Fincastle, I imagine that she contributed considerably to her recipe book. And these recipes are how we began our research. We had read about Karen Hess, a culinary historian, who wrote in 1982, "No other aspect of human endeavor has been so neglected by historians as home cooking. The homely art of the hearth has never been deemed worthy of the same study as other disciplines. We know this has changed some today, that the homely art, there's more interest in the homely art of cooking. But our original objective was to write an article and identify the cuisine of the Figgett and Godwin families through these manuscript recipe books, Nannie's diary and her ledger, estate wills, inventories, and such. We agreed with culinary historian from New England, Susan Oliver's definition of cuisine, and that is to describe a group's cooking and food habits, what happens in the kitchen, the source of food, and how it was cooked and served. Nannie and her mother's recipes help interpret the region and the culture. Her diary also contains the Figgett's records of food expenses for 1861, and these add to the culinary documentation of the times and their place in history. There are, of course, missing pieces of information. For example, we know very little about the African-American servants that they had. Their correspondence mentions once a family farm, but we don't know if they actually received any produce from that farm. Often, Nannie and Martha Mary's recipes are just a list of ingredients, but they still indicate their skills, their cooking methods, the ingredients, the equipment, food practices, and economic patterns. Both Nannie and Martha Mary prepared foods which had changed little over the years. Their recipes reveal that they prepared foods in kitchens that had changed little over the years. The recipes reveal that they were cooking at the hearth, which was the typical method of cooking in the South in the 1800s. And though iron stoves had become available in the 19th century, they really weren't used in the South until after the Civil War, when the servants had left and they had to do more of the cooking themselves. The estate wills of Nannie's mother-in-law and Nannie's mother list the kitchen and dining equipment and furniture owned by the two families. So we know these were gentry families. They had a variety of equipment. They could prepare a medley of recipes, and it kind of corroborates what Damon Fowler, the editor of Dining at Monticello, wrote, that 19th century Southerners ate a veritable smorgasbord, and rural Southern cooks were more cosmopolitan in their culinary knowledge than had been previously thought. We were fortunate that, so this is a page from our book that is published by the Botetourt County Historical Society, which is where Fincastle is, and it's a fundraiser for them. It includes 8 color pictures that that Billy Raper, the executive chef at the Hotel Roanoke, prepared, adapting Nannie and Martha Mary's 19th century recipes with 21st century ingredients. Throughout the war, these families and their neighbors and friends continued to have guests, some for extended periods of time, which is another indication that they weren't impacted adversely by the war. In addition to Nannie's recipes and diary, we also have 2 surviving recipes of Lucy Breckenridge and Letitia Burwell from the same region of Virginia, interestingly enough, that also talk about the foods that were available to them at this time. So more than half of Nannie's 152 recipes are for desserts. I agree. Usually the desserts were the provenance of the mistress of the house, while the day-to-day food preparation was left to the servants. There were 2 reasons for this. One was the mistress of the house wanted to control the expensive ingredients that were required, the sugar and the spices. But secondly, she took pride in demonstrating to her family and guests her cooking skills. Cake making, you know, was hard work. You started out with a cone or a loaf of sugar that you had to crush. The flour probably had to be dried in the hearth to eliminate the moisture. The eggs, of course, had to be gathered from the hens and whisked, and of course the whisk was made by hand. And then there was milking the cow and churning the butter, of course. The spices were ground with a mortar and pestle. Dried fruit had to be seeded. The brick oven had to be fired with wood till it reached the baking temperature, and then it had to be cleaned out, and the cook would stick her hand in the oven to see if the temperature was right, and then bake the cake. With desserts prominent in everyday recipes, maybe absent, Nannie's recipe book documents that she knew food variety and food preparation methods. Her recipes point to an abundance of food and the ability to acquire a variety of ingredients. She also reveals through her recipes that she used sophisticated seasonings. So this is the house where Nannie grew up and where she returned while Charlie was at the war. And if you look behind the house, you can see these outhouses. This was typical of the big houses in town. Remember, she had 10 sisters and brothers. There was a root cellar, a spring house, and a smokehouse. And Nannie's recipe book included 3 recipes for preserving beef. They were to pickle 100 pounds of beef. Why do just a little? Spiced round and spiced shad. So while the Godwins had servants, her mother was a very busy woman, and here's a description of her typical day. Although I have not been idle, there is little to show for it. I commenced doubling my carpet chain, had balls doubled when your pa brought in a pair of pants to make. The girls wanted some cotton prepared for knitting. Then Tom brought 4 pair of drawers to make. Then there was towels to hem for the store and the back porch. I have hemmed 9 yards of stiff linen today. I just give this as a sample of the way my time goes, with 100 other little things between times. Just as I think I am almost through, something else comes up. So Martha Mary's book only had 82 recipes. And we feel this was because she was an experienced cook. She didn't need to have everything documented. But 20% of her recipes were for household tasks. Many of them she mentioned in her letters. Her recipes are written in many different hands. As I said, Martha wasn't very literate, and she didn't particularly like to write. But it also provides evidence of the social interaction among family members and friends. Her recipe book included many pieces of loose stationery, as well as some pasted-in clippings, and this one would have caught my eye too, a recipe worth $1,000. It admonishes every poor, tired woman to try it. I think with a patent wash tub to do the little rubbing, the washerwoman might take the latest novel and compose herself on the lounge and let the washing do itself. Her recipes included other things about cleaning and laundry, but also treatments for illnesses and infections. Nannie's letters document doctor's visits, and I'll talk a bit about them, but her mother's recipes also had many remedies for felons, that's an infection, emetics to produce vomiting, and ointments. Having a home drugstore was an adjunct to the housewife's cooking stores. Her mother also had 7 recipes for dyeing fabric and clothes, and Nannie's September 20th, 1864 letter to Charlie suggested, if you have an opportunity and want to speculate, just buy some dye stuff and send it home to sell. Logwood and bluestone, $6 a piece. This is the house across town where Charlie grew up, and it's still standing. In his correspondence, he refers to it as the house on the hill, and today it's called Aspen Hill. There's little mention of slavery in the Figgett and Godwin documents that we found, and when there is, they speak quite kindly of them. For example, in April 1860, Charlie's correspondence to Nannie mentions Mammy's illness and a week later her death, and he talks about it as if it's the first time someone close to Nannie has died. And he wrote, "Such is life. Death swallowed up in victory, the grave robbed of its sting, and peace now in eternal sunshine, we are permitted to hope, is the gain over our loss of the loved and faithful servant." 5 months later, Nannie's brother Rob wrote about a Negro insurrection. Captain Figgett, that is Charlie's father, quote, "came up the street and got some gentlemen and went down there and found some 20 to 25 Negroes holding a prayer meeting after 1 o'clock in the morning. Old Tom was ordered to leave the county, so he was free, a free man. He was ordered to leave by next Tuesday. I do not believe they met there for anything else but to sing and pray and enjoy themselves in their own peculiar way. There were none except members of the church." So Nannie endured a lot of tragedies while Charlie was away at the war. And she would have talked to him about them, but instead she wrote in her diary, or wrote letters. The 2 incidents that did affect her most immediately because of the war was her brother Tom had his arm amputated after Gettysburg, and her brother Rob was a prisoner of war for 4 months. So Nannie suffered these and other difficulties without her husband, and she detailed them in her diary, more so than in her letters to Charlie. She was very explicit, more than I want to reveal, when her sister Jenny died of scrofula, or tuberculosis is what we know it by today. But she also wrote about her younger son, Charlie Meade's death. Well, first his suffering. For example, on November 27, 1863, Nannie wrote in her diary that Meade was ill from teething. The previous week, he had been treated twice by, quote, lancing germs and had spasms. Treatment, mustard bath to feet, cold water to head, and mustard to spine. So as I said, Nannie's entries are usually quite concise, but these two deaths, she documented the agonies that she might otherwise have shared with Charlie. And she wrote this in her diary. At 10 o'clock and 10 minutes this night, the spirit of my darling babe took flight to the bosom of his Savior. Oh, could his dear papa have been with him and me, but God knoweth what is best, and I will cast all my cares on him. Meade seemed to suffer greatly. This is her diary. This is what she's writing. The clammy sweat of death came at 3 o'clock p.m., and he was almost constantly convulsed. About 7, I thought him dying, but three long hours lapsed ere he was released. Her second son was buried next to Nannie's sister at what has become known as the Godwin Cemetery in Fincastle next to the Methodist Church. The following year, 1865, or 2 years later, Nannie, Charlie, and their first son, surviving son, returned to Lexington, and Charlie returned to his job at the bank. He was really successful. He was a well-admired and respected man of the town. We know from various newspaper articles and ledger entries for nearly 3 decades. But on February 14th, 1895, Charlie just walked away. He got on the train, he left his wife, he left his children, he left his community and his job of over 30 years because he had embezzled $180,000. Those are contemporary dollars, not today's dollars. He brought down the Bank of Lexington permanently. Yes. So while we wanted to focus on Nannie, it's hard to ignore this part of Charlie. It's part of their story. Unfortunately, her brother Bob was also implicated, and he spent 3 years in prison. So this part of our story is revealed largely through this piece of ephemera, a wanted poster that is surviving in the Special Collections Library at the Virginia Military Institute, which is also in Lexington, Virginia. But we found over 75 newspaper articles around the country. They were looking for Charlie everywhere. He was written about, what he had done was written about in Chicago, in Baltimore. Remember, this is that, I showed you on the map, little Lexington, Virginia. He's infamous. San Francisco. There are even newspaper articles in New Mexico about this man, as well as, of course, the regional and local newspaper. So one county newspaper noted that the Figgets lived simply and unostentatiously. But it also said Charlie was never satisfied with devoting himself to his duties at the bank, but for 25 years has devoted attention and money to outside interest. It listed many of his investments, which were in a variety of coal and coke companies and Lexington manufacturing. He owned houses, lots, and acres of land in and around Lexington. But the article also noted that he did not manage his business affairs well, his personal affairs well, either because, quote, he could not give personal attention for lack of time or gave careless attention through his dissipation. That is, people thought that he was drinking too much because he had a guilty conscience. Charlie was never apprehended, but from a newspaper article, we learned that he had changed his name to Charles Miles and made his way to Colorado. He died almost 4 years to the day of his walking away from Lexington at the home of a Mr. Wills. Charlie left a note in his Bible with the name of his brother. It just said J.H.H. Figgett, Fincastle, Virginia, but Mr. Wills wrote, and eventually they worked things out. They sent a photograph of Charlie to Mr. Wills. He sent the note and the Bible back to the Figgets and the Godwins so that they could be sure this was the same man. And indeed, this was our Charlie. That same year, 1899, Nannie appeared for the first time in the Roanoke directory. That is the Roanoke, Virginia directory. And she moved there to live with several of her grown children who had also moved to Roanoke. Thomas Godwin, who was referred to Godwin, was the first child to move there. And we have some photographs. We have some others that aren't identified. We know for sure that these are their children. They were photographed by Michael Miley and are available at the Washington and Lee Special Collections Department. Godwin graduated from Washington and Lee also, and we have Martha Mary's letter from 1885 that says Godwin is out of business. So we think this may be when he moved from Lexington to Roanoke. Many people, most men I think who lived in Roanoke worked for the railroad. That was the center of what would become the Norfolk and Western Railroad. His younger brother, Sandy Pendleton, those of you that know anything about the Civil War, there was Alexander Swift Pendleton, was a famous man, so they named their second son after him, the first one born after the Civil War. He also worked for the railroad, except for a brief period that I'm going to tell you about, where he owned a fancy grocery store. He was also quite a golfer and won several club championships, so these things are documented in the local and regional newspapers. Jessie was their oldest daughter, and she became a nurse. We know that for a year she trained in Massachusetts because her name is on a graduation list at a nursing institute. But she died just 3 years later after marrying a Mr. Agnew, which we don't know anything about him yet. So they had 3 other children, and from the Roanoke directories we know that Jane was a librarian at the Roanoke Public Library. Susan Madison was a nurse, a Red Cross nurse, and they had a younger son, Miles Floyd, who was also a clerk for the railroad. So Nannie was never able to escape the infamy of Charlie's crimes. She is always listed. She lives in Roanoke for more than 20 years, and every year she's the widow of Charles M. Figgett. Fortunately, she was surrounded by her children who were having their successes, and this is an example. The Roanoke Times for August 15th, 1897, said that Sandy and his older brother Godwin announced they were opening a fancy grocery under the headline, "Changes Hands." It announced that Sandy P. Figgett and Company were taking over the popular grocery firm of Pittman and Evans that would continue at the same business address, 116 Salem Avenue. When it got close to time for their store to open, they had lots of ads, but there were weekly ads in every newspaper while they had the store. But prior to opening, they advertised things like a full line of fancy cakes, crackers, and all kinds of the best canned goods. Fresh line of Tenny's candies, chocolates, and cream bars. Fresh cream and taffy bars, 10 cents a pound. And finally, I'm a librarian. I can't stop doing research. That's why it took 4 years probably for us to publish this book. One of our last finds was this stained glass window. It's been in Roanoke, for years, and we never knew it until just a year or so ago. It was dedicated to Nannie by her children. They went to St. John's Episcopal Church in Roanoke. She died in 1919 at the age of 84. And she and her children, except for Godwin, are all buried in Fincastle at the Godwin Cemetery. So with Nannie and Martha Mary's recipes, we could not have gained the same understanding of their lives, their culture, and their times. We agree with Marion Tyree, the 1879 author of Virginia Households, that to know the actual food pattern of an era, there may be no better source of information than a cookbook. So it gave us a very different picture than we would have had if we just had the letters and diary. So our story began with such hope and romance, but I wouldn't say that's what we see in Nannie here. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes for questions. I know you're anxious to get to the fair. Thank you. Yes?
How did the cookbooks, the recipes, and all the associated materials that are part of the manuscript collection come into the collection?
These materials are dispersed, widely dispersed. And I believe that Nannie was the keeper of the records because she and Charlie corresponded while he was at the war, and he must have brought his letters home, and then she kept them, and he abandoned them, and she kept them. But at Virginia Tech, we have the 2 manuscript recipe books, and we've digitized them, and they're available online. Any of you who might be interested in looking at them can see them, the actual pages from the recipe books. So the 2 recipe books, her diary, which includes the ledger of expenses from 1861, and about 5 letters between her mom and dad are in special collections at Virginia Tech. Then the Library of Virginia and the Virginia Historical Society have about 3 dozen, I'd say, letters between Nannie and Charlie during the Civil War. I recently found one in Philadelphia, in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, at the U.S. Army Education Center, something like that. The newspapers are I found online through the Library of Congress, but there are also additional newspapers at the Roanoke Public Library. I mean, we used things from all over. The wanted posters at Washington, or at the Virginia Military Institute, why they would have that one piece when everything else is at Washington and Lee University, I'm not sure. But it was just a librarian's dream. It was just a fun winter to do all, to research. And I just kept finding things. It's incredible that all of these things, relating to Nannie and Charlie exist. And we were able to pull them together in our book. Yes?
Is there any knowledge of what he did with prodigious fortune? That he died with 28 bucks? What happened?
Well, we believe that he didn't walk away with much, that he had been spending the bank's money for over 25 years. And we believe that he was, he bought into these various coal and coke companies. He was buying land. He was speculating, he was buying and selling and not making profits. So yeah, he didn't walk away with much of anything. Thank you, Donnie. Any other questions or comments? The book is here if you'd like. If I've piqued your interest in it, I'd love to. Thank you very much.